Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Countries like India, Iran, Russia and Turkey would have to fight against terrorists in Afghanistan at some point of time, US President Donald Trump said on Wednesday, ruling that the job against terrorism was being done only by the United States. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze India's Afghan policy. Joining me on the program today are Vivek Karju, former ambassador, Major General Dhruv C. Katoch, retired, Director, India Foundation, and Sreeram Chaulia, Foreign Affairs expert. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Sreeram Chaulia, the dynamics have changed in Afghanistan as well. It's no longer just the Taliban. You have Islamic State too, coming up very strongly in Afghanistan. So how do we deal with this problem of, two really strong forces?
Yeah, Frank, this happens in most of the complex long-term so-called internal wars, that factions break away from the main rebel group and then they continue waging war even after agreements are signed, and then if further fragmentation happens. You've seen that in Colombia, you've seen that in the Philippines and many other battlefronts. So Afghanistan seems to be headed that way, and many people in the Afghan intelligence, the National Directorate for Security, are of the view that the ISIS faction in Afghanistan, which recently committed a massive suicide bombing on a Shiite, wedding festival ceremony, that it's actually in itself being enabled by the Pakistani military and the intelligence complex. So although on paper it is ISIS, on paper it sounds like a non-state actor that is not under control of anybody, it looks like the Pakistanis now realize that once the Taliban enter a power sharing agreement with the Afghan government as part of the US peace process, then the question is they will not be as pliable as they were before. So then we need more puppets to be able to continue to have so-called strategic depth, and one of the puppets could be the so-called ISIS factions, especially in the Nangarhar, in the eastern part of Afghanistan, that have not been vanquished despite a few years of existence and of being troublemakers. So it is going to be a complex security environment, and in fact, the Haqqani network, which is very close to the Pakistanis and is now embedded within the main Afghan Taliban factions. See, that also what happens to them after the so-called peace process works out. You see, so ISIS will remain a threat, and then of course the Taliban. And as far as the US goes, that residual force we are mentioning, I think there are two reasons. One is there are multiple factions within the US state structure. There are the Pentagon and the so-called deep state, who want permanent power projection in this region for strategic reasons. Similarly with the Middle East, they don't want to fully pull out of Syria. But on the other hand, there is Trump and the populists and the ones who are keen to face the domestic American electorate and say, look, I finally pulled us out of all these costly and unwanted wars, right, and I'm bringing home the peace dividend, and this is America first. Let those regional players sort out the mess. It's none of our business. We are 7,000 miles away. So this is the tussle, what some people call a two-track presidency within the US, and the factional warfare is playing out in the form of this kind of compromise solution. They are neither fully out nor fully in, and sure, in that kind of situation, ISIS or their so-called the avatar of ISIS there is likely to become bigger, because they are directly attacking people on sectarian grounds, unlike the Taliban, which made itself more like a Pashtun or a broader ethnic or a nationalist movement. So this is more divisive and more hitting at soft targets like ordinary civilians, much more than Taliban, and more easier for the Pakistanis to manage, because there is apparently a link between the so-called Pakistani Taliban on the Pakistani side of the border and these ISIS factions.
Sure.
So I think when Trump says Pakistan should be fighting terrorism, they are doing very little. Factually it is true, but when he says they should do more, actually the opposite is true. Actually they should be restrained and pushed out of Afghanistan rather than interfering more. So that shows the daftness with which Trump reads the situation, but his overall picture is buck passing,
Right. Right.
America has had enough. We don't want to take on more responsibility. Let the regional players take more responsibility. And in that context, definitely we need to reevaluate, as General was saying, some more things we could do. We're training about 1,000 or more Afghan military officers every year, and maybe we need to expand that. Maybe we need to think about the role of the Central Asian republics around Afghanistan, and we have very strong ties with them through the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We may need boots from their side on the ground, and some of them have capable militaries. So lots of combinations have to be thought through, because we cannot leave it to Trump, because he is going to create a vacuum, a total vacuum, and he has made it quite clear.
Okay. So that having been said, Sreeram Chaulia, do we need to get to the root of the problem? At the end of the day, we know is Pakistan. So at some point in time, everyone needs to come together and get Pakistan to do something in Afghanistan.
The only one country, Frank, that actually can impress upon Pakistan and apply pressure is China, because Pakistan's lifeline is China now, and it's a good sign. Last year, after the Wuhan process, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping agreed on a China India +1 model in Afghanistan. We started the training of the Afghan diplomats. So China and India came together and did that. So that's a good step forward. I believe even security cooperation, China and India should be able to advance this formula and do something. So one is to, as we said, to restrain Pakistan and to bind its hands. And for that, I think only the Chinese can drive sense, because they have got the creditor rights over Pakistan through the China-Pakistan
But do you see China doing that?
Well, if they are willing to cooperate with us to build the capacity of the Afghan diplomatic corps, why can't they cooperate with us and with some other interested parties in the region to build the security and to create this cordon that generally is talking about, and to make it a secure zone free of external interference. So I think the Chinese have the capacity to do that. It's just that they have not really delved too deep into it, because they have looked at it from a very transactional point of view. If Trump is transactional in this, the Chinese too. They are just letting the Pakistanis do their Afghan policy, but it's going to come back to bite them, you see, and that's because of the fear of the Islamist extremism in Xinjiang. So I think overall, if you see, that's one country we need to rely. US pressure on Pakistan, this is an old game that has not really worked. We know it. And we in India, we are very cynical about it. Trump actually, as withdrew almost the entire US military aid to Pakistan and keeps occasionally making some threatening noises. It does not really produce a behavioral change in the Pakistani attitude. So ultimately, but there is a movement inside Pakistan that all in the region should be encouraging. There is a Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which ethnically they are the same group as the Taliban, which is fighting on the other side, and they are opposing the Pakistani military's barbaric behavior in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan.
Right.
So that is where you see the hope lies within Pakistan in some sector, where civil society is coming forward and saying, we don't want this informal military dictatorship. Ultimately, that is the way, because PTM, Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, is has got kindred on the other side in Afghanistan. Everybody sympathizes with their genuine humanitarian cause. So these are the kind of things that we should be laying emphasis on in the long run, because otherwise this powder keg, as generally saying, it's not uncommon for wars that you think are over, and then you say now in a post-conflict, but then again in a few years there's a return in another form. In fact, that's what we are seeing in Iraq as well. It's going through multiple phases of Islamist resurgence.
Right.
So I think the root cause is there. You're right with Pakistan, and also with the governance within Afghanistan. I believe India can do more for administrative reform and for governance support, because that's where the state failure has inevitably fed to more and more militancy over years and decades.
Absolutely, right. And Sreeram Chaulia, close the show for us with the concluding
remarks. Frank, India does not need a certificate from Donald Trump for all the sacrifices and the blood and treasure we put into that country to build Afghanistan. And the US is in an isolationist phase. They're withdrawing, least interested or conflicted about what their core interests are. So I think, in a way, Trump is a blessing in disguise, because he is putting the onus on all of us in this region to, no longer, we cannot free ride on US security assistance and presence in the region anymore. So I think all the more reason why creative regional diplomacy, as well as cooperative security mechanisms within our, within Central and South Asia, through SAARC, through CSO and all the other forums, we need to mobilize them quickly and have them in place as a, backup plan, to avoid a possible takeover of the entire Afghan state
Right.
and machinery by unwanted elements. So this is the time really
Sure.
for us to be playing a proactive role, and I'm sure Prime Minister Modi and his think tank have plans in mind.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.